I want to talk about free will, and in particular, I want to talk about the fact that in the last couple of decades, a lot of psychologists and neuroscientists have been claiming that they have scientific evidence that we don't have free will. So I want to talk about whether or not their arguments are actually good. And spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that they're not good. So before I start, I want to just flag an issue that I'll come back to later, but I want to bring it out at the beginning because you might be thinking it as I'm going through. So a lot of people think that the problem of free will, the question of whether we have free will, is related to the question of like what kinds of things we are. And like really broadly speaking, we can distinguish two kinds of views of human beings. Right? One view is some kind of like religious spiritualistic view that everybody's got an immaterial soul, right? So in addition to your body, you've got like a non-physical soul that like drives you around. And when you die, your soul goes to heaven. And the other view is a materialist view, right? That we're just physical bodies and all of our mental life comes out of our brains, neural activity. And I'm not gonna, thank God, try to settle that question today, which of those views is right. But you might be thinking that there's a relevance here. In particular, you might think like, oh, if I have a religious view, I can get around these scientific arguments. I'll come back to that later. But for now, I want to just kind of, like most of the scientists that run these arguments are materialists, and I want to grant that for the sake of argument. That's actually my view too, that materialism is true. So I just want to grant it for the sake of argument and take their arguments on their own ground. But later I'll come back to this issue of the spiritual view of humans. Okay. So let me start by just giving the case against free will. And I want to start by giving a classical argument that's hundreds of years old. And the classical argument is just that we don't have free will because some kind of determinism is true. So determinism is the view that every physical event is deterministically caused by prior events. So once you have a description of the state of the world at a certain time, together with the laws of physics, that just automatically implies the next state of the world and the next state of the world. So there's always a unique next event. And this is intuitively, this view is really plausible, right? Because we have this intuition that like, you know, if I hit a cue ball into the 8-ball, it's not like the 8-ball could go in different paths. Like how the 8-ball goes is determined by how the white ball hits it. And to give another case about how deeply this intuition seems to us, or how deep it seems to us, if we set up two pool balls next to each other and you and I hit the two balls at the same time, and my ball goes 12 inches and yours goes 11 inches, we can ask like, why did that happen, right? And you might go, oh, I hit my ball a little bit harder, or my ball weighed a little less, or there was more friction on your part of the table. But imagine somebody going, oh no, none of that. You guys hit the ball with the same amount of force, the two balls weighed the exact same thing, there was the same amount of friction, everything was exactly the same, your ball just did go further. There's no reason. That seems kind of crazy to us. And that feeling that seems crazy, that physical events don't just happen like that, just is the intuition that determinism is true. So it seems right, but the consequences of determinism are really kind of striking, right? So if determinism is true, then once the Big Bang happened 13 billion years ago, it was just a slow, inevitable march to all of the events we witness, right? So it was already determined 13 billion years ago that there was going to be a hurricane in the Bahamas this year, right? Because once the Big Bang happened, the next event was picked out by the laws of physics, and then the next one, and then the next one, and it was just this slow, inevitable march to that hurricane. But not just hurricanes, also your decisions, right? So if determinism is true, then it was already determined 13 billion years ago that every neural event that was going to happen in your head was going to happen exactly as it has happened. So all of your decisions were already determined 13 billion years ago. And if that's true, then clearly we don't have free will, or at any rate, we don't have the kind of free will that I'm talking about and that the scientists are talking about. You can define other kinds of free will that are compatible with determinism, but the kind I'm talking about and that these scientists are talking about is a kind that if it was determined before you were born that you're going to make every decision you do, then you don't have free will. Okay, so that's a very old argument, but there's a big problem with the argument. And the problem, which probably a lot of you are aware of, is that it just relies on this intuition that determinism is true. But one thing we learned in 20th century physics is that determinism is actually a very controversial empirical claim, and our best theory of fundamental reality, namely quantum mechanics, is a probabilistic theory, and whether there's like a layer of determinism under the theory is very controversial, and there's basically no good evidence that determinism is true. So it's an empirical question whether determinism is true, and there's no evidence for it. So the argument, that classical argument for free will, seems like not very good. But it's a short-lived victory for free will because we can fix up the argument, right? And in fact, I want to tell you two ways to fix the argument. One's sort of a philosophical argument, and the other is a scientific argument. So the philosophical argument goes like this. Look, it doesn't matter if determinism is true, because, look, if there are undetermined events, an undetermined event is an event that just happens. So it's uncaused and it's random. And random is no more compatible with freedom, with the kind of freedom we sort of intuitively imagine ourselves to have, as determinism is. So it looks like there are two, you make this decision and there are two possibilities. One is it's caused. And if it's caused, it's determined and it's not free for that reason. And the other possibility is it's not caused, in which case it seems like it's random. It just like popped into my head or something, and then it's not free either. And so whether it's caused or uncaused, it's not free in either case. So there's a philosophical argument that still talks about determinism but doesn't rely on determinism against free will. But there's also a scientific argument that fixes the argument in a different way. And it goes like this. Look, it doesn't matter if universal determinism is true. It doesn't matter if every event is causally determined. All that matters is whether your decisions are causally determined. And we have scientific evidence that they are. And the evidence comes from psychology and neuroscience, right? And so the psychological arguments are older, and they go kind of like this. Like over the last 100 years, we've built up a kind of a mountain of evidence for the claim that lots of what we do is caused by stuff that we're, like unconscious stuff that we're totally unaware of, right? So just to name one example of this, and this is something, I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard this stuff in like Psych 101 class. Like if you own a cinema and you're showing previews of coming attractions to people, and you splice a single frame of a bag of popcorn into the movie, it goes by way too fast for anyone to consciously see it. So nobody's aware that they saw a bag of popcorn. But the probability that you're going to get up and go buy a bag of popcorn goes up, right? And so clearly your behavior is being caused by unconscious stuff that you have no awareness of. And that's supposed to undermine the idea that we have free will. Okay, so that's an example of the kind of thing that psychologists say. So now I want to tell you about two arguments from neuroscience. And the story here starts in the 1960s when neuroscientists found something they called the readiness potential. And the readiness potential is a certain kind of neural activity that occurs just before voluntary actions. So they found that in the 60s. And then in the 80s, there were these studies done by a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet. And he had the idea, I think his original thought was, oh, maybe the readiness potential is just the conscious decision, and that's what's happening right before the action. So he wanted to establish a timeline for the conscious decision to act and the readiness potential and the act itself. So he did this study where he wired people up, and he gave them the instructions that whenever you, I want you to flick your wrist at some point. As soon as you feel the conscious urge to flick your wrist, do it. And they were watching this big clock with a second hand that went basically measured time in milliseconds. And the subjects were supposed to report the exact moment at which they felt the conscious decision to move. And what Libet found was that the readiness potential arose about a half a second before the conscious intention to act. So, unconscious brain activity, conscious decision to act. And so the conclusion Libet drew, and basically all the psychologists and neuroscientists agreed with him, was, oh, well, the brain's already doing it before consciousness even enters the picture. So we don't have free will in that intuitive sense. Consciousness is just sort of pulled along for the ride, like noticing what's going on, and you tell yourself this story like, oh, I decided to do it, but really the brain was already doing it before you were aware of it. Okay, so this was extremely influential, and there's been a ton of follow-up studies. And I just want to tell you about one recent study that's a lot more striking. And it's done by a neuroscientist named John Dylan Haynes. And what he did was he gave subjects two buttons, one for their left hand and one for their right hand. And it was a very similar setup. So he told them at some point, pick which one you're going to choose, left or right. And as soon as you decide, push it. But also he gave them this way of reporting back the time at which they decided. Okay? And they were picking between left and right now instead of just to move. And here's what Haynes found. 7 seconds prior to the conscious decision, he found brain activity that predicted whether people would pick, whether they would push left or right. So when you hear that, you're like, what? Like a neuroscientist looking at my head 7 seconds before I pick what flavor ice cream I want, they can tell me what I'm going to do? You're like, okay, so definitely we don't have free will, if that's true. Okay, so there are the arguments. And I want to respond to them. But before I do, I want to come back to this thing about the religious view of humans. And because you might be thinking, look, if you think a human being is a physical machine, then it's no wonder you get the result that we don't have free will. But if you think we have like a non-physical soul in addition to the body that's not like subject to the laws of physics, then we can make room for free will. But I just want to point out that it doesn't really help answer the arguments if you believe in a soul, right? So help yourself to a soul. And I mean, so let's just look at the Haynes argument, right? He's going to go, look, believe in souls if you want. Here's the reality still. Before your soul makes a decision, 7 seconds prior, I can tell you what you're going to do. So help yourself, believe in the soul, but it's not solving the problem. So that's the scientific argument. And even the philosophical argument seems not to help because, so here's a little bit of a background point. Even if you believe in souls, it can make perfect sense to talk about your decisions being caused because they can be caused by mental stuff, right? So here's a case. Imagine we've got a person, Rachel, and she wants to go visit her mom, or let's put it this way, she has to go visit her mom. She doesn't really want to. And she can either fly or she can take the train. But she's deathly afraid of flying and she loves the train. And the train's gonna take 10 hours instead of 2 hours, which means she's not gonna have to spend as much time with her mom. Plus, she's been wanting to read this novel, and if she sits on the train for 10 hours, she's gonna be able to read it, so she's like, I'm taking the train. Okay, so now we ask, why did she make that decision? And it seems like even if you believe in souls, you can go, well, because she had these beliefs and desires and so on, and that caused her to make this decision. Now, you don't have to say that if you believe in souls, but you can. It makes perfect sense. Well, let's just say this. I'm not going to claim it doesn't make sense. So if you believe in souls, you can still talk of causation of decisions. But now you get the same dilemma. Is Rachel's decision caused? Yes or no? If it is, well, it's not free because it's determined. And if it's not, it looks like it's just random. And so it's not free for that reason. So it's not clear that appealing to souls is going to help solve the problem anyway. That's all I have to say on that topic. Now I want to go back to assuming some kind of materialistic view and seeing if we can respond to these arguments, meeting these people on their own turf. Okay. So another preliminary point before just directly responding to the arguments is I want to say a little bit about what free will is, or rather what it would be if we had it. And again, I'm talking about this indeterministic kind of freedom, what that kind of free will would be if we had it. And the reason I want to talk about this is because when scientists talk about free will, there's a lot of confusion about what it would be. And I think the confusions end up leading to bad inferences about why their results show that we don't have free will. Okay, so in particular, I want to clear up 4 things that I see get confused in the literature. So the first thing, I call it remnants of spiritualism. And here's what I mean by that. So again, these scientists, in particular, I'm talking about neuroscientists now, they're in general materialists. And then when they go to talk about things like decisions, mental things like decisions, they talk about the neural correlate of the decision. And I think that's a really bad way of talking if you're a materialist. That's a good way of talking if you believe in souls, right? Because you should think, well, there's the decision, and then there's the neural correlate of the decision. But if you're a materialist, you shouldn't think there's 2 different things, right? That's like, you know, it's like talking about Mark Twain is the literary correlate of Sam Clemens. Like, I don't know. There's one guy. Mark Twain and Sam Clemens are the same person, and the 2 names, Mark Twain and Sam Clemens, that's just 2 names to pick out the same guy. And if you're a materialist, you should think, look, the only thing up here between my ears is neural events and neural states. So the decision, if I'm a materialist, has to be a neural event. So when I say, oh, my decision to order chocolate ice cream and neural event such and such, those are the same thing under 2 different descriptions. And if you don't keep that in mind, you get led astray. And we'll see, it'll come back in later. Okay. Second confusion has to do with the location of free will in our lives. So a lot of scientists write as if they just don't even talk about this, and then you have to sort of back engineer what they're thinking about. But a lot of times it seems like they're thinking about free will as attaching to like all of our actions. And that's not a great way to think about it, because if you think about it, during your day, you're like doing actions constantly. You're constantly doing things, and virtually none of them do you think about it. Right? So just think about this case. You're going for a walk with a friend, and you're totally engrossed in a conversation with them, and your mind is totally on the conversation. But while you're talking to them, you're constantly going, move the left foot, move the right foot. But you're not thinking that. You're not like having to decide, oh, I better move my foot now. Oh, wait, look out for that pothole. Walk. Like you're just doing it without thinking about it at all, and there's no mental involvement. Like later, you're like, oh, I didn't even notice we walked all the way around the lake. So I think it's much better to think about free will in terms of our decisions, our conscious, like our mental life. But we can get even narrower than that. So it's lots of our conscious decisions are sort of picked out uniquely by our reasons, right? So in the case that I was talking about before with Rachel, right? She had these 2 options, but like she had no reason whatsoever to fly, and all of her reasons said take the train. So it was a no-brainer decision. And so in that case, it's like, yeah, who cares if my reasons cause my decision? Let them do it. So I think we need to narrow in even more and find the locus of free will in a certain kind of decision that I call a torn decision. A torn decision is when you're sort of going through your day and you come to like a fork in the road where you're like, oh, these 2 options, they both kind of look good. Which one should I pick? Oh, I'll take this one, right? So you go into an ice cream parlor and there's 30 flavors, and you look and you're like, oh, 28 of them are crap. But these 2, chocolate and vanilla, I'm not sure. And then you get to the front of the line and you're like, oh, I'll take chocolate, right? So it's a decision where you sort of see multiple options, and I'll just pretend there's 2 in these cases, but there don't have to be, that feel kind of tied for best for you. They're both good. And then you pick one. And I think that's the case where we want free will. That's where we want it to be like, oh, it's me picking the path. Okay. So it's not a thing that's happening all the time. It's like a few times a day. You know, when you come to these choice points, you're like, oh, I'll do that. So it's the choice point moments, or as I call them, torn decisions, because you're feeling torn. Okay. That is where we should be. That's the crucial place to look for free will. Okay. Next confusion. To get clear on the kind of indeterminism that's needed, and I'll say one thing about it now and a little bit about it later. The thing I want to say now is just that only one aspect of these decisions needs to be undetermined for it to be free. Lots of aspects of the decision can be fully determined. So in the ice cream case, it can be fully determined that I'm going to make a decision, right? I'm not going to get to the front of the line and just like stare at the person because it hasn't come to me what's better, right? That's not good. It's much better to like make a choice. So it's determined that I'm going to choose. And it can also be determined that I'm going to choose from my best options, like chocolate and vanilla. I'm not going to choose like bubblegum surprise because that's crap, right? So lots of it the only thing that needs to be undetermined is which of my tied for best options I choose. Okay. And the last point of confusion I want to talk about is to get clear on what's meant by randomness. Right? So I want to grant, everyone should grant this, some kind of non-randomness is needed for free will. If a decision just happens to me, that's not me choosing, right? But the word random gets used in a lot of ways and it can drive us down a bad path if you're not clear, right? So you might go to Vegas and like the dude throws the ball and it lands in 22 black and you're like, oh, that was random. And really all you meant by that is it was like unpredictable or something. And in quantum mechanics, we measure an electron for spin and it comes back spin up. And you might say that was random. And you might mean not just that it was unpredictable, it was fully uncaused. Right? So random might mean uncaused. But I don't think either of them are what we really mean by non-randomness, the kind of non-randomness that's needed for free will. The kind of non-randomness that's needed for free will is it's got to be my decision. It's got to be that I did it. And as long as we have the case that I did it, that's the kind of non-randomness we need. And that looks, at least at first blush, it seems like, oh, maybe that's compatible with it being uncaused. Like I did it, but I was uncaused. And as soon as you think that, so here's the model I want to give you for what free will is. There's two requirements. It's got to be non-random and it's got to be undetermined. And you can think of these together in the following way. It's got to be that I did it and nothing made me do it. If I did it and nothing made me do it, then that's the kind of free will we need. But now, if that's what free will is, then we've got a response to the philosophical argument against free will. Because the philosophical argument was based on this claim that if a decision is caused, then it's just random. And I want to go, but wait a minute, it doesn't automatically follow that if it's caused, it wasn't me that did it. We got to think that through a little more. Those are two different ideas. Now, maybe it'll follow in some way, but I want to try to convince you that not only will it not follow, but in fact, the opposite is true. That if it's uncaused in the right way, then we're going to get the result that it's non-random in the right way. Okay? And so here's how the argument goes. And like, it's a long argument. I'm going to sort of boil it down a little bit. But here's a way to think of it. And it's related to this issue of the neural correlate of the decision that I was talking about before. So if indeterminism is true, then there are some undetermined physical events. And it's really easy to fall into the trap of going, oh, so if they're just undetermined, it's either determined, in which case it's not free, or it's just an undetermined random physical event that makes me choose. And I want to go, no, that's the wrong way to think of it. The undetermined event, if my decision is undetermined, then the undetermined event is a physical event, it's a neural event, but it's also a mental event. In particular, it's my conscious decision. So if the decision is undetermined in the right way, then let me back up a little bit. If determinism is true, we get a very simple model of the universe, right? There's an event, and then a unique next event, and then a unique next event, and so on. If indeterminism is true, you get a different, more complicated model. The universe looks like a garden of forking paths. And the node, like at the fork in the road, it's like you can think of it as a node event or a fork in the road event. And what that is it's an undetermined event, and the two paths coming out are possible futures. And the undetermined event happens that like spits the universe down one path. So the universe like takes one path through the garden, and possible futures are left behind untaken. And the thing that settles what path it takes is this node event, this undetermined event that spits the universe one way or the other way. And here's the point I want to make. if our decisions are undetermined events, then they are node events. So the event, the undetermined event that determines whether the universe goes down the path where I'm eating chocolate ice cream instead of the path where I'm eating vanilla ice cream is my conscious decision. It's also a neural event, but it's my conscious decision. Okay, it's also made up of quantum events, but it is a neural event and it is my conscious decision. So we get the result that my decision is the thing that settles whether I get chocolate or vanilla. And that sounds to me like, oh, I did it. And if it's undetermined, then nothing made me do it. So if it's undetermined, we get the non-randomness and we get the indeterminacy, and so we have free will. And so we have a response, we have two results. One is a response to the philosophical argument, but another result is that the question of whether we have free will is reducing to the question of whether our decisions are caused by prior neural stuff. And that's a scientific question. So what we're getting the result here is that the question of whether we have free will is a scientific question. It is a question for neuroscientists. And so we have to take their arguments very seriously and see if they're good arguments. And that's what I'm going to do in a second. But I just want to pause for a second and point out that I'm sort of glossing over something here, because there's a continuum of possible cases of the degree of causal determinism here. At one end of the spectrum, when I choose chocolate ice cream, unbeknownst to me, something caused me to choose chocolate ice cream. And the objective probability of the two choices being made at the moment of choice were 1 and 0. So the probability of me choosing chocolate was really 1. I just didn't know that. At the other end of the spectrum, the choice is completely undetermined, and the probability of my two best options being chosen are 0.5 and 0.5. And in that case, I'm fully free in the sense I'm talking about. But in between, there's a spectrum of cases where there's like causal influence without determination, and the probabilities are like 0.9 and 0.1, or 0.75 and 0.25, or 0.6 and 0.4. And I think it can be argued, and I'm not going to go through this here, but I think it can be argued that the closer the probabilities get to 0.5 and 0.5, the more free I am. So the kind of freedom I'm talking about here comes in degrees. Right? But I just want to focus on the case where if they're fully undetermined and the probabilities are both 0.5, then we have this full-blown freedom. And so the question of whether we have that full-blown freedom comes down to this empirical, scientific question of whether these neural events that are our torn decisions are undetermined in the right way. Okay, so let's now talk about these arguments. So let me start with the psychological argument. So the psychological argument, remember, is that we found all this evidence that lots of what we do is caused by unconscious stuff that we're unaware of. And I want to go, yeah, we have found that out, and here's what that shows. One point to be made here is that almost all of the studies are not really about torn decisions. They're just about like actions in general. So that's one point. But I do think like the total of the evidence they've got does give us reason to think that at least sometimes our torn decisions are going to be caused, it's because I hated my mother that I chose chocolate. Yeah, sometimes. But what the studies don't show is that every single time you make a torn decision, there's some unconscious thing that's causing it. There's just no evidence for that. What they've got evidence for is this happens sometimes. And so the conclusion we should draw is, oh, maybe we're free less than we thought. But there's no evidence that we just are never free. Okay. So that's all I want to say about the psychological stuff. On now to the neuroscientific arguments, and I'll start with the Libet one. And there's just one crucial problem with the argument. So remember, his argument is we found this readiness potential, this neural activity that's before the conscious decision. And the problem with the argument is that we have no idea what the readiness potential is doing. We have no idea what its function is. We didn't know that when Libet ran his study, and we still don't know it. And so the problem is there's lots of things it could be doing that have nothing to do with determining which option is chosen. Right? So I pointed out before that lots of features of the decision can be determined. It can be determined that I'm going to choose without it being determined which option I choose. And for all we know, the readiness potential is part of the brain gearing up to make a decision without doing anything to determine which option we choose. And there's other things it could be doing. That's just one example. The point is, we have no evidence that since we know nothing about what the readiness potential is doing, we have no evidence that what it's doing is determining which option will be chosen. Okay. So that's it for the Libet study, but that response to Libet plays right into Haynes's hand, right? Because what Haynes is going to say is, no, that's what I actually did, was I found brain activity that predicts which thing you're going to do. So, and again, it's 7 seconds out, so it's a very striking result. And so we need to respond to this. And so that's what I'm going to do. But before, so like when you hear that result, you're like, whoa, that's crazy. But then if you go and read the article, like the journal articles where the results were published, you're like, oh, and like, you know, it's like new shit has come to light. Now I think I have a response to this. So let me just point out a couple things that are going to be relevant later that struck me when I was looking at the article. So one thing is that the region of the brain where Haynes found this activity was not, he didn't find it in a part of the brain that's normally associated with free decisions. He found it in a part of the brain that's normally associated with the formation and storage of long-term plans. So that's one point, and just put it on the back burner. I'll come back to it. A second point is, he couldn't predict what people were going to do 100% of the time. He could do it 60% of the time. Now, if you use flipping a coin to predict what people are going to do, you'll get it right 50% of the time. So he's 10% better than that. Now that's definitely statistically significant, so it's showing something, but it's not clear what it's showing. And I just want to flag that also and put it on the back burner. And what I think is these two things, when you put them together, they're very suggestive of a different explanation of the data, right? So, you know, whenever a scientist runs an experiment, they have some data, and then they have to interpret it and draw conclusions. And one way to block their conclusions is to accept their data, but give a different explanation of what's going on, right? And if you give like a wacky explanation, then, you know, that's no good. But what I want to do is give an alternative explanation of the data and an explanation that's compatible with us having free will, and then I want to try to convince you it's actually a better explanation than the anti-free will explanation that, that Haynes gives. Okay. So here's a little background point to my alternative explanation. If I want you guys not to think about Margaret Thatcher right now, like the worst thing I could do is go, hey everybody, don't think about Margaret Thatcher. Right? Like if I don't say that, nobody's going to think of her. But the second I say it, even if you want to obey me, it's like somehow hard not to think about Margaret Thatcher, right? And that seems true of decisions too. Like if I tell you guys 60 seconds from now, I want you to pick a number between 1 and 2, but don't do it yet. Like it's hard not to think of. Now you might be able to do it and like distract yourself, but it's kind of hard, right? And here's another thing. Given what we know about humans and subconscious stuff going on, you might subconsciously pick one of those two numbers without even realizing you did and like store a plan to it or like prime the number 1 or the number 2. In fact, this seems like a really plausible hypothesis. If you give the Haynes instructions to a room full of people, you know, you're going to have to push left or right, at least some of them are going to form a subconscious, they're going to have subconscious stuff going on that later determines what they do. Okay. That seems plausible to me. But that just gives us an alternative explanation of the data, right? So here's the explanation. Some of the people in the study, not all of them, formed a like they subconsciously primed one of the left or right, had some kind of like plan to do it, and then later it got activated. Now, if that's the right explanation, it's no problem at all for free will, right? Because if that's the right explanation, here's what it's showing. It's just confirming what we already knew from psychology, that some of what we do is causally influenced by subconscious stuff. Not all of it, but sometimes. So if this is the right explanation, this is not like the death nail for free will, it's rather just more evidence that sometimes we're influenced by subconscious stuff. Okay. So now let me give you 3 arguments for thinking my explanation is better than Haynes's. First argument, the 7-second time gap. So this is a bit ironic because when you first hear the result, you're like, that's the crazy thing that makes you go, what? But when you actually think about it for a minute, you're like, oh, that's part of what undoes the argument. Because the problem is human decisions don't take 7 seconds, right? We all know that. Anyone who's ever made a decision knows that, but there's also evidence that humans can make decisions in like a half a second. So whatever Haynes found 7 seconds out is not the decision, it's something else, right? And his explanation is like, oh, that's already the brain making the decision. Well, that doesn't look plausible. Second argument, the fact that the brain activity he found was in a region of the brain normally associated with the formation and storage of long-term plans, that fits perfectly with my explanation, but not at all with the explanation that this is somehow part of the decision. And the third argument for liking mine better is just the fact that he's 60% at this and not 100%. That fits perfectly with the view that like some of the people like primed it and are subconsciously influenced, but not all. And it doesn't seem like he has any explanation of this on the idea that it's part of the decision. So there's some reasons for thinking the explanation of his data that actually is compatible with free will is better than the one that's incompatible with it. Okay, so I don't think any of these arguments work, but I just want to give a little warning. What I have not done here is argued that we have free will. I've done something a lot more scary if you like free will. I've argued that this is actually a scientific question. These people are on the right track. They haven't done it yet, but future evidence could show that we don't have it, or future evidence, future theorizing and evidence might show that we do. But right now we should think this is an open question, and it's mostly an open question for neuroscience and maybe physics also. Like if physics shows us that determinism is universally true, then that would settle it. So I think the conclusion we should draw is that this is an open question for scientists.
Why is it common that free will is thought to be in the conscious mind, not the unconscious mind?
Well, look, free will is one of these words that gets used to mean different things by different people. And I sort of very quickly at one point talked about a kind of free will that's compatible with determinism. A lot of philosophers like that. Scientists hate that. You can define lots of different kinds of free will. So you could define a kind of free will that's in the unconscious mind. But I was trying to capture this sort of like folk notion of free will we have, where it's like, oh, I'm the captain of my ship. And what we mean by that is like, I make the decisions and that's what settles the way it goes. And if it turns out that like, oh, there's like subconscious stuff I don't know about that's like driving the ship, that kind of that doesn't fit great with the intuitive pre-theoretic notion. You could define another notion and like think and theorize about that, but it would be a different kind of free will, and I think it would be not the kind of free will that like we intuitively, the one we learned about on our grandma's knee or something.
Can we talk about free will without mentioning the consciousness and the entity we are talking about? For example, we are talking about the consciousness, the free will of the human. So what about the free will of a monkey or a bacteria, plant, molecule, river, the universe itself?
Yeah. Well, monkeys are conscious, I would guess. So I think that I think it's really implausible to think humans have free will and monkeys don't, right? So you have there's an evolutionary chain, and you have to think about, so we have language and they don't, or at least sophisticated natural spoken languages and they don't. Free will seems to me lower down the level than a language, and it seems really plausible to me that if we've got that kind of indeterminism in our brains, then they do too. So I have no problem with the idea that monkeys have free will, and I would suspect that the answer is either yes for both of us or no for both of us. If you go down to, as you go down, can parakeets have free will? Well, I'm okay with that. But if you start going down to trees, so it's a thing that's not conscious at all, then I think that what I want to say is sort of this, well, you could define some kind of free will, like the tree like turns to the sun. But that's just a very different kind of thing than what we usually mean by free will, which is like a conscious decision is like this, like the locus of free will, like of what we want is like when I go, oh, I'm picking this. Like, and that's just, I don't want to argue that that's the right view. I just want to go, that's the kind of free will I have in mind. And if you want to define a kind of free will that involves a tree turning to the sun, that's fine. That strikes me as a different enough notion that we should probably have two different terms, like free will 1 and free will 2 or something. And then that's fine. I have no problem with it. But it doesn't seem that a tree can have free will in the sense that I'm talking about.
I hope I'm not simplifying things too much, but if you hold a materialistic view and you find with assimilating your own self with the physics that's going on in your brain, then whether this physics is deterministic or not, like, wouldn't it just always be free will? So, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. So I think I see what
you can always say, I made the decision.
Yes.
Because this is me.
Yeah. So so let me say a little bit more about it now. So this is a very popular view among philosophers. And it's a very old view. It's not clear who was the first person to hold it, but it was made very famous by David Hume. And like, when was he writing? The 17th century, 18th century? The idea is this. Being free is being able to do what you want or something like that. So I've got this conscious decision. It's caused by my beliefs and desires and wants. And what more do you want than that? And here's what I want to do. I want to just go, call that Hume freedom. We have that kind of freedom. That's for sure. Anybody who's ever done what they want knows. Now here's another kind of freedom. The kind of freedom that if it was settled before I was born that I was going to do all of this stuff exactly as I don't have that kind of freedom. Call that undetermined freedom. Okay, so now here's what I want to say to you. My answer to you, instead of using the word free will, let's get very clear. Hume freedom. Ask your question using the term Hume freedom. I'm going, yeah, no matter what the physics is, we know we have Hume freedom. We know it just by like reflecting on ourselves. Now here's another question. Do we have undetermined freedom? Well, you can't settle it by doing that because it could be an illusion, right? It could feel like we're having this undetermined thing, but it's not. And so my question is, do we have undetermined freedom? And I want to grant to you, yes, for sure and certain we have that kind of freedom.
I've always felt that in asking this kind of question philosophically, yeah, we're totally at the mercy of the physicists and what which I think you kind of hinted at. I've also always thought when I've had these discussions late at night that what's the difference, like what is actually the difference between the free will and determined? It would look the same either way. Yeah. There's an example in some of your reasoning. There's something I want to bring up which I think might be interesting. So I'm a free diver. So that means I go underwater, hold my breath, and it's interesting. Like with breathing, like the heart, it just beats and you just breathe. But breathing's a bit different because you can stop it. You can just stop. So when you're underwater and everything's telling you to breathe in your body, you have to override that. And when you start to get several minutes in, then one of the tricks you employ is to consciously engage the subconscious. So I actually call upon my subconscious to take me into fantasies, take me into wherever, to stop me thinking about that I'm trying to breathe. So I'm interested to know what you think about the conscious engagement of subconscious and the sort of complexity that adds to maybe some of that argument. Also, the decision, it's not like I'm going to go get the popcorn or not. It's like every maybe infinitesimally small fraction of a second is that same urge to breathe. And every single infinite moment, I'm making another decision. No. Sometimes it might be yes and then I reverse it, But like, how does that then play with the probability and statistics part of what you've said?
Yeah. Okay. So there's actually two questions there. So let me answer the first one first, which is what difference would it make? And I want to say, like, a lot of people go, oh, it makes all the difference in the world for morality and our legal system and all this. And I kind of feel like, come on. If we got compelling proof from physics, like, it would be big news. And then, a week later, Lindsay Lohan gets a DUI and So I don't think it would be a big deal, but I want to say that here, like just introspectively, like, so I made this decision to order chocolate. Now here's two possibilities. One is the decision was uncaused and the thing that really settled it was my decision. And the other is like, oh, some shit that I wasn't aware of did it. What difference does it make to my life? And I think there's two answers. And it also, I think, depends on just our personalities. Like, of course it doesn't make any big difference. Like, I'll just go about my life and like, I won't be focusing on that uncaused, that stuff that's unconscious. But I also have this feeling that like, I just don't want that to be true. And it's not like, oh, because then, no, it's just because I just don't want it. I want it to be the case that my decision did it. And I think some people are like, no, I don't care. And others are like, oh, I want that too. So that's basically my kind of flat-footed answer to your what would it matter question. The other question is like super complicated and there's lots to think and say about it. But I haven't much thought, like I agree with you, you can do that. You can engage in, we do that not just when you want to breathe, but like, you're working out and like you have 2 more minutes to go and you're like, just think about something else because I really want to stop. Like we do that kind of thing all the time. And I kind of think most of it, it's super interesting, but I think most of it's tangential to the free will issue because I think that the stream of consciousness is tangential. And I think it's really important to stay focused on the issue of torn decisions and like the fork in the road moment where you're going through your life, blah, blah, and then you hit the road and you're like, oh, should I go with my friend to the movies or stay in and work? Like, I'm gonna work. And it's those moments, and if you focus on them, like, I don't think it's a very common thing to go, well, let me engage my subconscious to help me, like maybe sometimes, but, so I think it's a super interesting issue, but maybe not super relevant to this issue.
I wanted to ask about the neural event that you described, and to kind of avoid an infinite regress of physical causes, how do you ground the neural event, like the 7 seconds before? Do we have anything that indicates what it was that caused the brain to start ramping up or doing what it's doing for readiness? Because the non-physicalist or the non-materialist is going to say, well, that's a metaphysical grounding, like the soul essentially, that's triggering the brain. And of course the materialist is going to go, well, no. But then the question is, well, what is it that's actually starting that process?
Yeah. So I think that it's not really fair for the spiritualist to say that's the soul ramping it up 7 seconds before, because the spiritualist should presumably say that the crucial thing is the conscious decision. And this is 7 seconds before conscious decision. Then the spiritualist would be into like subconscious soul stuff and like it would be problematic for them. As for the other part of your question, the answer is basically they don't know anything. Like neuroscientists, look, they've made huge strides, and I think a lot of it is super interesting, but it's in its infancy as a science. And like basically what Haynes is gonna say, I don't know, I just found this activity and it correlates. This pattern correlates with left. This pattern correlates with right. I don't know anything else. I don't know anything about what that is or what the causal connection is. I just see the correlation.
Hi, you've spoken about a neural event or a mental event determining a fork and a path. Does that imply that consciousness is something physical in the universe that's able to influence that quantum event to happen or not?
Yeah, that's not my view. So this is a really good question. So first of all, I think that if you're a materialist, you should absolutely think that consciousness is a physical thing in the universe. Influencing the quantum thing, I want to resist that. But first I want to make clear that there's really if you're a materialist, you only have 2 options. One is consciousness is a physical material thing, so a conscious event is a neural event. Or you have to say there's just no such thing as consciousness. Because if you're a materialist, there's no room to go, oh, it's this other non-physical, no. You don't believe in that. All you believe in is physical stuff. So if we can all agree that there is consciousness, because we all have an inner life, if you're a materialist, you should go, so it is physical. The conscious decision where I went, I'll have chocolate, is a neural event. Okay. does that influence the quantum stuff? No, that's not the right way to think of it. The right way to think of it is the neural event is made up of quantum events. Those are the parts. The neural event is undetermined in virtue of its parts being undetermined. So there are two models. The model that I've been talking about, maybe this is right, is that the undetermined events, which are ultimately quantum events, are parts of the decision. So the decision itself, the macro level event, is undetermined. Another model is prior in time, there's undetermined quantum stuff that then causes the decision. That would be the prior causation, and you don't have free will. So it's not that the decision causally influences the quantum stuff, it's that the decision ultimately just is quantum stuff. Everything is quantum on this view. Right? So it's kind of like this. If I throw a baseball through a window and I go, the baseball broke the window, and you go, oh no, dude, quantum events broke the window. And I'm like, yeah, of course, but the baseball's just made of quantum stuff. Right? The quantum stuff breaking the window just is the baseball breaking the window. And likewise, the quantum stuff settling which way I go just is the neural event determining which way I go, and that just is the conscious thing determining which way I go.
Going back to the intuitions about why we sort of care about this issue in the first place, it seems like most of the time when people make some intuitive argument for free will, they sort of use this idea of counterfactuals, of like, I could make this decision or I could make that decision, and I can think about what both of those worlds would look like. But I guess as you know, when you work with AI, you realize this is just a sort of nice operation to have, to be able to consider things that you could do, and this is, you know, even compatible with determinism. Like, this is what chess computers do, right? Yeah. So I guess, are there intuitive arguments for free will that don't rely on, or that aren't based on ability to evaluate counterfactuals?
Yeah, so that counterfactual view is a compatibilist view. So it's compatible with determinism, and so it's back to this question, like, yeah, that's just a different kind of free will that I am not talking about. So that kind of argument for this kind of free will won't work. It's a very good argument for a different kind of free will, right? But for this kind of free will, that won't work. And so your question is, are there other arguments for free will? And I think an argument that some people would run, I don't think there are any good arguments, because I think it's an empirical question, and I think it's a hard question about the causation of neural events. But so I think some people have this kind of view. Well, I've got a very strong introspective intuition that I've got free will, and if there's no scientific evidence against it, that carries the day. And I'm going to go, no, it doesn't, because that could easily be illusory. We don't have access to the causal structure of the brain. So, I mean, while some people want to run arguments that we have an indeterministic kind of free will that aren't scientifically based, I just think those arguments are all bad. And the only way you could motivate it is by advancing a lot in neuroscience and like finding our decisions in the brain, which we're not even near being able to do, finding causal pathways and going, oh, and you know, I don't think we're anywhere near there. So my view is that the answer to your question is no. There's no good argument for free will, for this kind of free will. Those kinds of arguments you're talking about are an argument for a different kind of free will, the compatibilist kind.
How would you comment on the relativity aspect of this? So my point here is all of our study is inherently very anthropocentric. And that's understandable because we are humans and we study the world as we know it, as opposed to some absolute terms. And here the question about free will might seem inherently flawed because like, what is free will? We seem to treat the decisions as some discrete moments, as opposed to part of the continuum of the flow of time. And in that continuum, if we dig a little bit deeper, then everything is determined. So yeah, that is my view, but again, my view is predetermined by some of the machine learning data that is in my neural network based on my life experiences, like that my neural network has been exposed to so far because it was predetermined by the universe so far. Yeah. So why, as humans, are we thinking that, for example, gravitation and some other physical forces that we know, what a planet, does a planet or a star make a decision to move No, it doesn't probably, or it does. So this brings us to the point of relativity. So relatively to us, to our consciousness, yes, we have the free will, but in terms of the absolute terms, we don't seem to. And that is comfortable for us because we like to think we are humans, we are the pinnacle of the evolution and stuff like that, but like I'm not a big fan of anthropocentrism. So what would be your comment on all of this?
Yeah. So I'm not a fan of anthropocentrism either. And if the worldview you have, the deterministic worldview is true, then I would just go, yeah, we don't have free will. Turns out relativity theory is incompatible with quantum mechanics and they're trying to figure it out, but like the theory of the bottom level of reality, the best theory we have is quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics is a probabilistic theory. Its laws are, some of its laws are probabilistic. Some are, the Schrodinger equation is deterministic, but the Born rule's probabilistic. And it's a very open question how to interpret quantum mechanics and whether there's a hidden layer of reality under the quantum layer that's deterministic. So Einstein and David Bohm thought there was. And if Einstein's right, the world's deterministic and we don't have free will. But I just think it's an open question. I don't think you have great empirical reason to believe that worldview. I think it's an open question whether there really is indeterminism at the fundamental level of reality. And I don't want to think of it anthropocentric in any kind of anthropocentric way. I want to say either indeterminism is a feature of reality or it's not. And if it is, then local events at a local point in space-time can be undetermined. And that's independent of worrying about frame of reference or anything like that. A local event, if indeterminism is true, it's true through the fabric of reality, and there are local events all over that are undetermined, and the idea here would be that there are local quantum events that are undetermined, and those quantum events make up a decision in such a way that the decision is undetermined. I take that to be compatible with all the evidence we have, and I don't think that the evidence we have gives us good reason to believe determinism is true, because I think it's an open question in physics whether determinism is true.